welcome to Spybrary. My name is Jeff Quest, and I'll be your host today. I'm very pleased to be joined by Matthew Bradford of the site Double O Section and Tim Shipman, the political editor for the Sunday Times. Today, we're going to be talking all about book collecting and specifically collecting spy novels. We'll be talking about some of our favorite finds, handing out a few tips, and maybe what some of our white whales might be. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So, lots of people read spy fiction, but only a small percentage become collectors. So before we get too far into things, I was hoping that each of you might share kind of how you got into collecting spy fiction. Tim, why don't you go first?
Well, I mean, my introduction to it all was back when I was a kid, to be honest. We had a couple of secondhand bookshops in the small market town where I grew up. And I started putting together a sort of paperback collection. And the thing that caught my eye particularly were those Raymond Hawkey covered pan paperbacks of the James Bond novels. And I built up quite a nice, clean sort of collection of those. And then I just, I bought a lot of books. I read as much as I could. And for a long time, it was basically about the reading. Then I wrote a couple of books myself, and I had a little bit of money sitting around and thought, what do I do with this? And I bought some watches and I did some other stuff and I frittered some away. And then I just sort of occasionally bought the odd first edition. And I thought it would be nice to try and actually build up a collection of books, because books are what, my first passion. They're what, I like doing in life, as well as, for recreation and for work. And so the last sort of 2 or 3 years, I've been trying to build up collections of, the obvious authors like Fleming and Mccary and Adam Hall and Joseph Cannon, those guys. About half of what you see behind me is now sort of first edition fiction, and almost all of it is spy fiction. So that's how I've done it. And, on the other side is all the sort of non-fiction stuff, which is more to do with politics and my work and history and all that kind of stuff. It's a thing that you can do relatively cheaply, but if you want to chuck a bit of money at it, you can find all sorts of exotic and exciting things. But, the fun is going through, finding an eBay auction where something is £5 that ought to be £50, and snapping it up before Matthew Bradford comes along. And similarly going through, those shops. I ordered one, a book called The Drakov Memoranda the other day, just as a paperback. I hadn't read it. It was impossible to find. I don't think there's a hardback first edition of it even. And I paid about $3 for it. And it arrived and it was signed. And it was just like, that was the first time I felt I've just had a Jeff Quest moment here, even though it was a virtual one.
Well, and for folks listening, what you can't see is Tim has this wonderful, huge bookcase behind him. It's at least how many shelves high there? 8, 9?
9 or 10, yeah.
Yeah, and it's, goes at least, I don't know, way far over, at least probably 10 feet. It's beautiful and wonderful backdrop. It makes everybody watching this jealous right now, at least me, for sure. So, but with that, I was wondering if you could maybe, because what I found is collectors, even within, like, say you're collecting spy fiction, there's certain kind of niches that you go for, right? There's certain kind of things that you dial in for. I know, not to get too far ahead, Matthew, I know, is more on the bound find special limited editions. Do you have any specialties that you particularly kind of go for in your book collecting that you found over the past few years?
Well, I tend to focus on, the standard first edition of a book, which is obtainable. I tend to collect British firsts for British authors and American firsts for American authors. The punishment for a Brit trying to buy American authors is you can pick up the book for $15 and then the postage is $35. So you have to pick and choose a little bit there, and that's why I've tended to get actually better bargains buying American authors, because you're looking for the really cheap bargainful book. Often when there's an author with two editions out, I think, I like the cover art. The great thing about those pan paperbacks with Bond is that there's multiple different covers and they all look fantastic. Take the Adam Hall books to an interesting case in point. I've got 2 copies of the Tango Briefing here. the American one, which is this one, is signed and very exciting, but it's a pretty boring cover. Whereas this is the British edition, and it's actually, you know, it's much more kind of exotic to have on the shelf. So that signed one is now the only American Adam Hall I have. I've been collecting the British ones as a result of the fact that the cover art is more exciting. And particularly with the James Bond books, there's lots of different editions of the hardbacks. Obviously, you want to try and get a set of Jonathan Cape first editions if you can, though the first few are punishingly expensive, and I haven't got myself there yet. But there's loads of other ones. There's MJ Fine Communications editions, which are beautiful to look at. There's a sort of Penguin Centenary reissue, which have got lovely covers. But that's why those pound paperbacks are a great introduction to it, because you can buy them all the time. Really nice copies for $15, you know, £10. You know, they're really good. So I've increasingly got into cover art, and then the more, you know, I mean, we're only in the first question here, Jeff, but we're already just going down the rabbit hole. You then start getting people offering you, well, here's this thing that you never knew about, and it's really rare, and it's $500, and you really must have it. And after a while, they sort of prey upon you, and you try and freeze these things out of your mind. I mean, there's a Bond paperback, the 14th edition of Thunderball comes with a fake Players Cigarettes letter, or you can pick up a 14th edition Thunderball on eBay now for about $3. If it comes with the Domino letter, you're talking £300 to £500 just for one slim slip of blue paper.
Well, you know, I think one thing that all collectors will find is you have to fight real hard not to fall down those rabbit holes.
I haven't remained above all of the rabbit holes, I think it's best to say.
All right, so Matthew, what is your collector origin story?
It was really also like Tim, it was James Bond is where it started for me. And it started back in middle school, kind of as soon as I started reading James Bond books. Well, then it was the 90s, it was the early 90s, and it was the only time that Fleming's been out of print in America. And well, that's not totally true. There were still the charter ones with the silhouette covers in paperback. There were still some of those, and some had gone out of print. And by the mid 90s, they would actually be out of print, even though Ian Fleming Publications likes to say that he's never been out of print. He was in America for a time until those beautiful Penguin paperback retro covers came along. So I had to look in used bookstores, was kind of the way to find Bond books. And most of what I bought to read were Signet paperbacks, which were kind of the common American paperback cover at the time. They used to be, you know, used bookstores used to be absolutely loaded with them. Now they're less so, but they're still probably the most common thing to find in an American used bookstore. And then I went to, like, not a paperback place, but a used bookstore called the Book Barn in Niantic, Connecticut. Absolutely great used bookstore. At that time, it was the lower floor of one building with an antique store upstairs in the barn. It's now, I think, 6 buildings at that one location, including that whole building and 2 other locations. And I would go on to work there in high school. It's been a big part of my life. But when I first walked in, I was looking for Ian Fleming, and they brought out a couple of books, including A Thrilling Cities, which I didn't even know about at that point, and it was a first American edition, and it was priced, you know, at like $10 instead of $5 because it was a first or something like that. But I didn't know what that meant. I'm like, well, what's a first edition? And Chuck and Randy, the booksellers there, they started explaining to me. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. And I just have this kind of collector's mentality already that, you know, was from trading baseball cards before that, or whatever, like just whatever kind of thing I was into. But this one stuck. And so from age 11 on, I'm still to this day collecting books. And so, yeah, I would spend my childhood looking for Bond books wherever we go on family vacations. You know, I would drag everybody to the used bookstores. My sister hated it. But I found, I mean, almost all my Fleming firsts I got in the 90s as a teenager, because today, once the internet came along and really changed collecting, as I'm sure we'll get into more, it just became impossible to have that kind of storied great find for cheap. But back then it was possible. And so I built up pretty much all the Cape firsts from Goldfinger on, and then all the American firsts, except for some of the, well, I have the first couple, but a couple of the early ones I've never managed to get, because American firsts, well, nowhere near as expensive as the British ones. They can also get expensive, but I didn't pay a lot for any of those as I got them. Like, I was buying on allowance and lawn mowing money or whatever, and then later on, as I said, my first job in high school was at the Book Barn at a used bookstore where I would work nights, and it was great because I would just sit there at the desk and read, for a while when I was the only person, you had to be at the desk, and until a customer came along. And then during the days when I was working, you'd be shelving and stocking, and that's just amazing, because you see everything. And I would also volunteer at library book sales during the summer to try to see those, and got some good like Fleming deals that way as well, seeing what's coming through before anyone else. And yeah, it just developed from there. The other authors I was into at the time were Robert Ludlum and Michael Crichton. They were my favorites then, and so I collected them too. It grew from Bond. Oh, there's a Bond first edition, and oh yeah, there's also Crichton first editions. And then as I got older, I got into more spy stuff. Mccary didn't become a favorite until after college, but I still have that collector's mentality. So I kind of, as I get into something, I have to sort of collect it. And at a certain point, I tried to sort of stop, put a stopper in the spy mania, because I didn't want to end up just collecting everything spy. So what I've tried to go for, other than a few authors who I do collect everything, I try to go for a first edition of their first book and of my favorite book of theirs, to have two representative books of each major spy author. Like Tim, I try to go for the American editions for American authors, the British editions for British authors. Like him, I have the reverse problem with buying, from overseas. The English shipping is so much now. So yeah, it's always easier for Americans.
If it weren't for COVID, we could have a sort of exchange of prisoners with suitcases.
Yeah, that would be, well, hopefully we'll get to that point.
Well, I just imagine hearing your story there, Matthew. I imagine those booksellers that you were talking about at the Book Barn. Like, you're like, oh, what's this first edition? What does that mean? I just imagine them like throwing out a reel and like they're kind of winding you in as they get the collector hooks on you.
Absolutely. They hooked me for sure. They know, every time I go back to Connecticut, I always visit there. They both still work there. And this COVID Christmas is the first time I haven't been to Connecticut for the holidays. And I miss my Book Barn trip. That's definitely, I miss my family the most, yes. but the Book Barn's up there.
Well, and you also collect limited editions, right? Which is a whole other kind of bit of mania that I have not I've tried to shy away from.
Yeah, you're right. We try to keep off certain things, and there are some areas that you collect that I try to stay away from. But yeah, limited editions. I just really, I guess that started also at the Book Barn, where we get particularly things from the Easton Press, which is a publisher in Connecticut. So they do a lot of leather-bound special editions of older books usually, although now they do a lot of new ones too. And then in the early 2000s, they did a set of, or in the late 90s, they did a set of first edition facsimiles of the Ian Fleming books. And they were really nice slip-cased facsimile editions, not perfect facsimiles, but very good of the Cape first editions. And for a while were a good alternative if you wanted, that look more cheaply. And the slipcases made them they look nice. They've now gotten expensive in their own right, and I didn't get in on those. But the next thing they did was a series of leather-bound Bond books, and I did get those as they came out. And so that kind of, I guess, got me on the leather-bound spy bandwagon. And they've done a lot. They've done a lot of Mccary. Franklin Press is the other big American publisher of limited edition leather-bound. And between Franklin and Easton, there are quite a few Mccarys, and they'll do special signed ones. And those, the best way to get them is as they come out. They'll announce that it'll be limited to a certain amount, so you kind of just have to order them when they come out. they're not necessarily the best investments. Some of them are, some of them have become very expensive, but others I managed to pick up fairly cheaply of the ones that came out in the 70s and 80s. Like Franklin would do these first edition, um, club sort of things. So like the Honorable Schoolboy, its first American edition was technically the Franklin leather bound edition. And it came with a letter from John le Carré and just a nice binding, but it was the same sheets as the general first US edition, the trade edition. And those aren't that expensive, really. It's pretty easy to come by those online or in bookstores. But yeah, some of the more recent ones are harder, like Easton's Hunt for Red October from just a few years ago is a pretty elusive one. And those Bond ones, of course, because anything Bond. Now, when we talk about book collecting as investing, you can't get better than Fleming. Like, he's just always going up, up, up. I wish I'd gotten all the first editions in the 90s when I was collecting, because the hundreds of dollars that seemed totally out of my dream space as a kid would now be bargains for those early capes,
Well, and I think you kind of highlight one of the bigger things in collecting anything in general is that don't try and, number one, other than maybe Bond, don't go into it trying to think you're going to get some huge return on investment, right? Because I think that's where folks can kind of lose their way. You got to do it because you love it first. And then if maybe someday down the line you can make some return, great. I don't know if you guys disagree on that one.
No, not at all. I mean, what I'm always struck by is you see these great sets online. There are various booksellers that we all know and love who will put a set of books up costing X £1,000. And then you just spend half an hour on eBay totting up what a decent copy of each of those books amounts to. And frankly, you can buy it for somewhere around a third to half of what they're selling for normally. So that's the markup you'd get in the shop. And fine, if you put yours up, you might get lucky as a set and someone might buy them. But most of the time it's you've got to do it because you love it. But Matthew's right about I mean, even at the moment, the non-first impressions of Casino Royale, you used to be able to get a sort of 6th or 7th edition in a nice, dust jacket for, I don't know, even a really good one was £150. They're now selling for 300, 400, 500, even for that. And a library edition of a first went for nearly £2,000 the other day. This is without a dust jacket. The prices are completely off the charts. I picked up a library copy of it a couple of years ago for £70, and it's in a perfect, dust jacket. On the shelf, it looks exactly the same as some of these things that are selling for, many multiples of that. It's some of the pricing is completely bonkers, and that's why you've got to be careful about those rabbit holes, because really, does it matter that much if there's a quad mark or a misspelling or all of the other things that everybody gets very excited about? Now, fine, well, there's a completely different copy of a book. So Le Carré's Single and Single is an interesting example. The one, the main first edition was preceded by a sort of handout set of copies, which are a bit smaller and have a frankly more interesting cover. And those go for a lot more. And if you can find a signed one, well, wowzers.
Do you have that?
I have. I've also got an unsigned one, which I'm thinking of putting a book plate in now because I could probably sell it for a large sum of money. I mean, that's the other thing. If an author's alive or dead and still signing, it makes a heck of a difference. The night John le Carré died, I bought a half a dozen of them, and they were, 30 or 40 pounds. The same books, signed are now selling for 70 to 100 pounds, simply because there is now a finite market of those books. That was a bit cynical. I was always planning to get a full set of signed le Carrés, but I felt if I didn't do it then, I was never going to do it, frankly, because it would be unaffordable.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard to tell whether that's going to be just a boom because of so many people, just because of the news.
Yeah, it may last for 6 months and then disappear. Yeah. The Fleming ones, of course, he only wrote 14, and they were quite small print runs on some of them, and a lot of them went into libraries and have disappeared.
And he was such a stingy signer because he was a book collector. So he knew the value of his signature, and he was very reserved with giving it.
Yeah. On the other hand, Mccary was very generous with his signature over the years, so which I appreciate as a collector.
As some people were observing on the Spybrary Facebook group the other day, that hasn't stopped a bunch of charlatans fake signing a whole bunch of books in recent times. And some of them are so comically bad, you know. So if anybody is just about to start getting into this, do your research. You know, there's loads of websites out there that will tell you everything you need to know about every minor pan paperback of Bond, every, you know, Le Carré twist and turn, different covers, different publishers. But, you know, his signature evolved as well. It looks slightly different from how it looked 10 or 15 years ago. But you can date those signatures to the right books and then you're okay. But some of the stuff that's out there now on eBay is an atrocity, really.
Yeah. Well, and the thing I've discovered too is, and maybe it was different for you two, but you make mistakes early on too, right? So just chalk it up to experience and realize that, okay, I blew that one.
You need to learn how to read a listing, particularly on eBay. You know, if the main pictures are lit funny, there's a reason for that. It's because the spine is massively faded and they're trying to disguise that. It might say first edition, and you know, when you come to book collecting, you think the first edition is the, you know, the first impression, but actually the first edition of a book can run for many impressions, and a lot of eBay sellers don't exactly draw attention to that. So if they haven't put up the publication page, it's because it probably isn't a proper first edition. Ask them for the pictures. Always ask for pictures. Look at, you know, most sensible sellers will put at the bottom, you know, the pictures are part of the description. So make damn sure you blow them up big and look for those blemishes and look for what might be issues. And the more you get, the more books you buy, the more you realize, you know, what the little tricks are that might trip you up. But I still trip up all the time, and I still feel like a fool when I do it. Equally, there are ways of, you know, there are tricks for you as the buyer. There are lots of people who sell, you know, ex-library books or books in bulk, and they don't put up a good listing because they don't probably have those books in their possession. They're all sitting in a box in a warehouse somewhere. And the later Adam Hall ones are a brilliant example of this. The ones published by W.H. Allen. They are, and is it Headline?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, good booksellers are selling these books for £400. You can get copies of them by going to these bulk sellers for £7, £20, and sometimes you have to get lucky, or sometimes in the case of one of them, so Quiller Kgb, I bought 3 different copies of that. The first one I bought had a decent dust jacket, but it was a library rebind inside. The second one I bought was the original book, but had a terrible cover, so I swapped the cover. And then the third one I bought for £7, and it was a proper first edition, and it had no markings in it at all. And that was just, you know, they all looked the same in terms of the listing, but knowing that I didn't want to spend £300 on a copy of Quiller Kgb, and there are 2 currently listed online in that ballpark price at the moment. And, you know, I probably spent £40 all in on 3 copies, and I've ended up with one I'm pretty happy with.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, sometimes you really do need to use your eyes when you're looking at those eBay things. But at the same time, sometimes it's worth just rolling the dice and seeing if you can pull it off, and it pays off.
So, Jeff, what's your origin story as a collector?
Well, I've talked to Shane a little bit about this in a previous episode, so I won't bore people too much. But this is several years ago now. I was going into a local Chicago used bookstore, one of those typical where you walk in and you have to go sideways because, you know, the shelves are so tight together and they're, you know, you're kind of scared things are going to fall on you. And I went to their kind of small spy section, and I was looking through there, and I pulled off a copy of Smiley's People, and it was a signed copy. And so I bought that just because it seemed really, for whatever reason, it called out to me. And so I bought that one. And then when I got home, I was like, you know, I love spy fiction. What if I had made it a point to try and collect at least one signed spy novel by each of all the major spy authors that are out there? And, you know, the one thing I've found with collecting is you got to find that kind of thing that you're going to focus on. Otherwise, it becomes too overwhelming. And so my thing ended up becoming signed spy novels. So trying to find signed copies. And from there, it's kind of ballooned over the years, and I've got probably over 400 signed spy novels now. For I've got all sorts of spy novels. I try and collect all of their novels if I can, and I'm not as dedicated to the UK versus US edition as I know you guys are for where they're from. And some of that is like Mccary. I can, getting a UK signed edition of his stuff is going to be way more expensive for me than I'm willing to pay. Because I'm also, that's the other part of it, is I'm kind of a cheapskate. So I'm much more about, trying to get those good deals, or going to the thrift store and looking through every spy novel they've got on the shelf and pulling out that signed copy that somebody has given away and spending $1 for it. So that's kind of my thing. But yeah, so that was kind of how I got started. Something for me, the thing about collecting signed novels was there's something about knowing that the author held the book in their hands that gives, for me, is that connection. And I'm a big, kind of history person. I like that history that's implicit in that, this author held that book in their hands, they signed it and then passed it on. And now I'm holding that same book. And so there's something about that is really appealing. So.
I like that too. That is definitely a huge appeal of signed books to me. However, it's not the case with a lot of those special editions that I like the Easton ones, because what they'll do is the authors will sign, pages and then send them to the publisher, and the publisher will bind that when they're binding the sheet, because it's a limited edition and it's made to be signed. So it's not quite the same. The author hasn't often and you're finding that now with a lot of just I guess in England you call them high street bookshops, but just like regular bookstores will do these kind of limited, maybe not specifically limited with a limitation number, but a certain amount that the author signs. In America, it's usually Barnes and Noble that you'll find them at. In Britain, it seems to be Waterstones, but there will be and again, it won't be a book that the author has held and signed. It'll be pages that they've signed in advance that are then bound into the book. So
and for newbies, that phrase is tipped in, is the phrase they use, I think, isn't it, Matthew? Yeah. When it's an extra page. So there's a hierarchy of signatures. There's flat signed, which is held the book, signed it. There's these tipped in pages, and then there's the sort of there's book plates as well, which it's a nice thing to have if they're real signatures, and it adds a bit of value, but it's not the same thing. But I'm sitting waiting for a Len Dayton book plate to arrive, so I'm pretty excited about that.
Nice. Well, then there's a whole other aspect, and this is, we're going to get into kind of showing off some of just a handful of our collections. And the kind of theme that I pulled together was more inscribed books. And that's, it's interesting because booksellers hate that for whatever reason. They only want to sell the signature, whereas I love seeing whatever my name's not Joe or whoever they signed it to, but if there's something really nice in there, and a warm dedication, they'll call it, right? I love that stuff because it just adds a little bit more.
It's also a good proof, isn't it, Jeff?
Yep.
If there's it's pretty obvious, but if there's more writing, it's a lot harder to fake.
Yeah,
agreed. All right, are we ready to show off some of our finds over the years?
Let's do it.
All right, Tim, why don't you start us off?
Well, let's start with those Adam Halls, which I was brandishing earlier. So I'm, holding up the British edition here, which has this plane, ploughing through. Great, looks nice, but this is one of the stars of my spy collection, which is an American copy of the Tango Briefing. Pretty boring looking cover, and I bought this. It said it was signed, so I thought, but there were no pictures, and I thought I'd take a chance. It was one of those eBay ones. I forget what I paid for it, but it was not much. It was $10 or $15. And inside there is this absolute treasure trove of things. So the first thing is this one has a dedication from Mr. William Poulter, QC, with my very good wishes. So that's quite a high-end lawyer who was sent this book. And that is signed by Adam Hall. It comes with a bookmark which has a Q for Quiller at the top of it, and it has Adam Hall scrawled on it. But it also comes with a letter from Elliston Trevor, which is Adam Hall's real name, from his place in Juan-le-Pin, which looks like a very nice corner of France. January 1964. My dear Libby, here's the Jack Tango, and it's a very long letter, and it's signed by Elliston.
Wow.
Equally, there's an Elliston Trevor calling card, which has his Los Angeles residence details on it. Thank you so much for giving us such a lovely evening with you in Sunland. Hasta la vista, Elliston. So for $15, I've got not one, but 4 different signatures, which
That's
is why
wonderful.
this book stays, despite the primarily British firsts in my Adam Hall collection.
That's wonderful. I love that. Yeah, I've had a couple of like Hall books that I've taken a wing on and had some good stuff come back on those as well. So like I bought the first French edition of the Berlin Memorandum, and it had this dedication in French from Hall to his French publisher inside, which was pretty cool. And he, you know, because all those guys back then spoke French, right? I mean, that was like you couldn't go to school and not speak French. Since we're on Hall, I'll show my Hall book. This is the Cobra Manifesto. Again, kind of, you know, not exciting, super exciting cover on here, but when you open it up, there is a nice dedication on here to Glenn and Kate, I think, with very warmest regards, Adam Hall, alias Elliston, and he wrote where he was at the time, which I knew because it said it was signed. So I was like, great. But then I looked under the dust jacket, and tucked under there was a letter, which I hadn't been expecting. And that one is from when he was in Arizona at the time he was living there. And he says, I hope you're not too busy reading all of those excellent reviews of El Shootist to look at the enclosed. He offers this, offered an homage to the man who finally put John Wayne on the map. And so looking it up, the Glenn referenced is the guy who wrote the book, The Shootist, that they then based the movie on. So that was kind of a fun little connection, because obviously Trevor was also involved in the movie business, and so I'm sure they ran in somewhat similar circles too. So that was a fun find for me.
That's great. Shall I do my movie one quickly, and then Matthew have a go?
Yes.
Again, this was an eBay find. So again, collecting Le Carre early ones is pretty tough work. The first 2 are thousands and thousands normally. Helpfully, after The Spy Who Came In From the Cold became a huge hit, they put out this omnibus edition, which is not cheap but can be found online. This is not a particularly clean copy. The cover, for those of you who can see it, is a little bit, the spine's a bit grubby. But again, the reason
the Galang specialty.
Yeah.
The grubby spine.
Yeah. And this is only a 3rd impression. It's not even a first. But the reason I bought it was because they made a film of Call for the Dead. And this book was owned by one of the sort of minor people in the film, and they helpfully got literally everybody to sign it. So on this spread, you have James Mason, Maximilian Schell, Sidney Lumet, the director, who's best known for 12 Angry Men. It's got Freddie Francis, the cinematographer who did a lot of great films. And this one isn't signed by Le Carre, but it's a little prize in my collection. I'm very fond of it. And it's totally, it's one of those ones that's it's totally unique. And it came with a little printout of who all the signatures were, because this is obviously someone who wanted to bequeath it. And again, I'm not saying this was cheap. I spent over £100 on it, but it's to me, a good, clean first edition copy of this, you can easily spend £300 or £400 on, and I got it for a fraction of that. And I think my copy is much nicer, frankly.
That's wonderful. Yeah, you're right. I mean, those Le Carre, I mean, the reason I collected, and for the folks watching, behind my right shoulder here, I've got my Le Carre firsts, and I collected the US ones because I knew that getting a full run of all of the UK ones was just going to be way out of my price range. There's no way I could pull that off signed. But I've gotten pretty close. I mean, I still, even with that, like getting the first 2 books signed, well, first 3 signed in American editions is still really crazy expensive. And I managed to get a signed Call for the Dead, which was pretty hard. And I got that cheap because I'm a cheap skate, even though it was still more than I like to spend. But
yeah, well, again, I have a signed Call for the Dead, but it's a nice library book, and that's why it was affordable. But it's nice because it's double signed. He's signed it, Mccary and Cornwall.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Very nice.
Excellent.
But then you turn over and there's nothing much you can do about the library stamp there on the. But again, and the other trick I was going to say, I mean, a lot of collectors can be very sniffy about this and they don't like it, and you have to have an original cover. But frankly, if you've got a bare book, there is a guy in the States who sells brilliant facsimile copies of most of the major dust jackets. Most importantly, he stamps on them that they are facsimiles, so you're not like faking anybody. It's just to make them look nice on the shelf. And I've bought quite a lot of those, actually. My Eric Ambler collection, again, the early ones, it's totally impossible to buy the British firsts for any kind of affordable sum. You basically need to be a multimillionaire to kind of collect those. But I, again, got an ex-library one, slapped it in a facsimile jacket, and it's, there's a mask of Demetrios that cost me £50. Stick a, $20 cover on it, and looks fantastic.
Yeah, I've bought covers from that same guy, and I used one on the copy of Ashendon that I have.
I have an American copy of. I have an American first of Ashendon with this. We probably have the same cover, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's great, and I'm with you on that. I think, everybody has their line that they're not going to cross, right? Some people they're never going to touch an ex-library book, but yeah, I think especially if you're just getting into things, I think this is something that you had mentioned before, Tim. And I know we're keeping Matthew held off here, but I want to see what he's got. But I think the important thing is trading up, right? I mean, I think if you get something first,
and then improve on it. But it's nice to have them to start with,
Yep. No, I agree.
I'm the voice of dissent on the facsimile dust jackets. I know. I get your points of it. Definitely looks nicer than a bare book. I'm a purist of dust jackets, and I think that comes from working in the used bookstore for informative years, where certain things are drilled into you, like the value is all in the dust jacket, which is fairly true. And book clubs are worth less than garbage. That's the other thing drilled into you. And that one, not as true. I kind of regret that mentality kept me from collecting a lot of the Bond book clubs that would come through at the time, which were all priced at $1. And I just really had drilled into me that you touch these things with holding your nose. But now that I've become more of a monolithic collector of Bond, I do wish I had some of those book club ones that went through, especially one that I really regretted was License to Kill by John Gardner, a novelization of the movie, because that's quite a difficult book to find in any hardcover edition. And there was the Armchair Detective Library published 3 versions of there was a signed limited slipcase edition, a nice I forget what they call the blue cover one. It's not in a slipcase, but it's a nice looking one with the same cover, and then a trade edition for libraries. Then in the US, there was that book club edition. And yeah, it became really rare and quite valuable. So I really regretted that slipping through my fingers, and eventually, years later, finally got myself a book club License to Kill. And I got a super bargain on it. Like you, Jeff, I don't ever pay a lot for these books. I like looking for bargains. But so it was good to finally fill that, but it wasn't as nice as I remember the one that, I disdainfully tossed aside in the bookstore. But that is, dust jackets are sacrosanct to me, so I don't like to put any facsimile on mine. I also, it's very ethical the way that you guys do it with this guy who stamps on them. I hate it when some more unscrupulous booksellers actually try to pass off, and maybe they don't even know, because that's my main thing against them. Once they go on there, even if a collector has the best of intentions, if it's not clearly marked, it eventually enters circulation. maybe they pass away and their books get sold to a store. And that's the worst, when you buy a book and you're excited about it, then you discover when you take the Broad art off that it's a photocopied dust jacket underneath. I hate that. So I don't do that, but you know, I don't judge you guys for doing it. Like you say, everyone has their own collector's preferences.
Well, and those British Bond book club editions have got beautiful jackets as well.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, I've got one missing. I've got Diamonds Are Forever is the one I haven't got, which is, I'm told, one of the harder ones to find. I mean, I've spent most of those I've picked up for £10, and someone's trying to sell me that because he knows I need it for £150.
Oh no. hold out. You'll find it eventually at a better price. But
well, what's yours with a real dust jacket, Matthew?
Well, I'm going to start with one, as we're on the subject of these movie sign things, and I absolutely love that book that Tim has. Not Call for the Dead, what do they call it? The Deadly Affair. The Deadly Affair set signed. That's an amazing find. I love things with association sign things that have a history like that. I don't like, another pet peeve of mine is when after the fact they get actors to sign like books with movies they're associated with, which is big in Bond. You know, like you see so many Man with the Golden Gun signed by Maud Adams or something, you know. And to me, if it's after the fact, it's like, it should be, I just want author signed or nobody, you know, Maud Adams' signature on there is just the same as some owner who wrote their name on it. You know, like that's marking up a book. But if it's something
this
that's
where I confess I've got a Roger Moore signed Moonraker then.
Okay, I mean, that's cool. You know, Roger Moore's name on anything is cool, but that's not something that I would like pay a lot for. To me, that, you know, but yeah, I know a lot of people are into that. But here, what I have here is also a movie related thing, and is also an association copy like Jeff was talking about. Now, this is not a valuable book anyway, like even, you know, just the regular first edition isn't particularly valuable. It's not that well known an author. This is For an Exchange by Jimmy Sangster. He wrote several spy novels in the 60s, 70s, and even, well, he moved to private detectives by the 80s, but he's most famous as a screenwriter. And he wrote all the classic Hammer films. He wrote Horror of Dracula, Curse of Frankenstein. So I think he's much more collected by movie people than book people, probably. And, you know, if you were to, his signature would be worth more on a Dracula poster than on a, you know, on a book. But this particular one, this is a UK first. I found it in an American used bookstore. Pulled it off the shelf, $10, you know, good price already for an author I like. And I already had the first American of this, but I really like these books, by the way. They're very, if you like Len Dayton, they're very much in the style of his Spy with No Name. There were only two about John Smith. And so I pulled it off the shelf and discovered that it was signed. And I'm not sure that they even realized that at the time because...
oh, I love that. I love that when they put them on the shelf and they don't realize. That's so
yeah,
good.
Because it looks, yeah, it looks like a gift inscription. You know, it doesn't look like an author signature, and it's only signed Jimmy S. You know, so I think they might have just seen it and thought it was like to Dad for his birthday or whatever. You know, but I read this signature, and it was for my favorite Americans, with lots of love for Marilyn and affection for Bob, Jimmy S. And I thought I knew, I mean, there was no question I was buying this book anyway. And it came, there were actually two Sangster books, both signed to Bob and Marilyn. The other one was Touch Feather, which was a different, he wrote two books about a female spy. But For an Exchange and its sequel called Spy Killer as a movie, they were both filmed and called Private Eye as a book, but changed to Spy Killer as a movie. They both filmed for ABC in America in 1969 and 70, starring Robert Horton, who had starred on this American show Wagon Train, and Jill St. John was also in them. And they're quite good movies as well as good books. They're impossible to find. You know, they've hardly had any legitimate releases, although one of them did turn up in like a 50 film DVD collection. But you can find them, you know, on YouTube sometimes. They'll come and go. And they're really good. And so I thought, my favorite Americans, one of them is Bob. Could that be Robert Horton? So I looked him up, and sure enough, his wife's name was Marilyn. So this was signed to the star, signed by the writer of the book to the star of the movie, which is, to me, a very interesting association copy. Then I found out that Horton had died in 2017, the year before I found this book, and lived in the area where that bookstore was. So it, I was certain that it was from his library. And I just love that. It's not, this isn't a book that's, a super expensive or rare thing, but that's another thing I like, is sort of the personal connection. Like, I feel like I was fated to find that, because I'm actually a big fan of those movies and of Jimmy Sangster. And that's a fairly cult thing compared to Ian Fleming or John le Carre. So it's like, yeah, this is, I was meant to find this, and I love that I did. So that's a favorite book in my collection there.
That's wonderful. Well, and I think personally, I'm jealous of both of you, because Matthew, you're in LA, Tim, you're in London, right? So I just think of, those are both places where there's lots of people with, connections to the book worlds, that, you've got those kind of signed copies just rolling around. Lots of people who are perhaps very wealthy and have paid just to get those kinds of books, right? I mean, you hear like, now the big thing is what, the Zoom wall or whatever, people buying all these books that are very expensive to have that kind of shown behind them. And I just think, like, those books then end up back in the bookstore for you guys to find. So I'm always jealous of that.
But
That's
I mean,
true. It depends where they end up, though. If they end up on the Charing Cross Road where all the sharks sell their books, you'll suddenly, you're better off on eBay, really, sometimes.
Yeah, and Jeff, you've got plenty in Chicago. There's a lot of great used bookstores there, more than have survived in Los Angeles for sure. And two, you have, your local authors. Like, you like to joke about how impossible it is to find a Bill Granger book that's not signed. We don't have that luxury in LA or London. But it is interesting to collect by location, because I made a trip to Phoenix once looking for books, Adam Hall signed books, because he'd spent the latter part of his life there in that area and went around to all the used bookstores. I didn't actually end up getting any. I thought I would find some there. I got a lot of stories about him, though, because he was a known figure to all these booksellers. And they, a lot of them said they do come through, because as families pass away, who have been, because he signed for all his neighbors. So, they do continue to get them through, but that particular trip didn't pay off.
Well, and now with the internet, you were saying, right? I mean, that's changed the whole ballgame, right?
Totally. I mean, for me, the thrill of collecting is when you're in a used bookstore and you have a great find like that. That is, nothing can match that feeling. But the world has changed, and you're not, even in bookstores, you don't get the bargains you used to, because the booksellers also look that up. And if they're a smart bookseller, they still know what they can sell it for in their area, and maybe that'll be less in a rural area, and then a New York dealer will come through and buy the books there and then mark them up and sell them for more in New York or whatever. But still, at least they have an idea of it. And then just online books in general, it's not as fun. It's not, you don't get to see the book, which I like, but you do get some great discoveries like Tim was talking about, where you're not expecting it to be signed and it is, or something like that. It has its upsides. And I certainly do the majority of my collecting online now, especially with COVID. Obviously that has changed the game completely. I can't go around to the used bookstores I used to love to habituate. And you have to buy online, and there's a certain thrill to that too. Also, what Tim talked about of, like, beating the other people or finding something that hasn't been listed quite right, so you're just hoping that no one else has searched for this misspelling of the author's name or whatever. And yeah,
well, there was an example of this recently. There was a first impression of Casino Royale, which had been rebound by the Smith's Library, the W.H. Smith's Library. So it's quite it's a bargain way of buying a Casino Royale, but even so, you're probably going to pay, £1,500, £2,000 for it. The way it was originally listed, and it was listed by like the British Heart Foundation charity, it was completely obscure and unclear what it was, and it was going to go for, a small number of tens of pounds, until a couple of guys on the James Bond Collectors Facebook group got in touch with them and said, you're actually sitting on something here, made them put up a load more pictures because they were a charity. And then the thing went to, a 48 bid auction and went for £1,600. So for a while, I think there were some people who thought they were about to get the steal of the century. I only came across it after it had been sort of flagged up and changed, but yeah, that was quite a good example of how something might have slipped through the net. But the great thing, frankly, is that you can find obscurities. You know, if a bookseller in some quiet corner of Canada has the one copy of the book that you really need in the world, and when I was collecting my Pan paperback bonds, I decided I wanted to get the first impression, the earliest impression of each different cover. So you're looking, you know, you're desperate to find, you know, the 8th edition of Casino Royale with the director's picture on the front, and you know, and there are even more obscure things than that. And you can find, you know, some bloke in New Zealand came through with one. I've had conversations with people in Canada, and then, you know, there's a load of people who sell Bond paperbacks, and they start getting in touch with you going, well, what do you need? And then when they get one in, they get it, you know. So it's not quite the same as going through secondhand bookstores. It's not quite as fun, but there's quite a fun chase element to it. And as I say, I'm still trying to plug a few gaps. So I've got people offering me things that, frankly, more than they know they're worth, because they think I really need them.
All right,
I will not be paying $150 for a book club copy of Diamonds Are Forever, in case anyone is wondering.
Well, and yeah, I do think like finding or buying stuff online and then having it show up and be something completely unexpected is so wonderful. I had something with I bought a lot of a couple of Le Carre books. It was like 4 books, and a couple of them were listed as signed, and I was like, okay, that's great. And then I open up the one I had the least amount of interest in, which was one of these collections of his first 3 novels, right? But it was like the second impression of this collection that was not that well put together in the first place. But inside, it was signed by Le Carre 4 times. So he signed it on the main page, but then at the start of each book, he signed it there too. So it was quadruple signed, and it completely unexpected, but so cool. And it's like obvious he was coming through town, right, and doing a signing, and somebody just grabbed whatever rando books they had on the shelf and just said, sign these, right? But it was such a fun find. So that's the thing that I love about some of that online stuff.
Yeah, you have the best luck of anyone I know with that. Like, it's the
All right, Matthew, you why don't you give us your next one?
Okay. Well, so this is one. This was a super hot title back in the 90s when I was working in bookstores. Tom Clancy and Anne Rice were the best, the most valuable modern firsts at that point. This is The Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy. It's quite a rare book. It doesn't have the value that it had in the 90s. I could never have afforded it for the prices that it was going for back when I worked in used bookstores. So for me as a collector, I'm thankful that it's come down in price over time, and I was finally able to get one. But investors would not be happy about that. You know, if they bought into Clancy or Rice, thinking those were only going to, both of those authors have gone, have depreciated in value rather than gone up. I think part of the reason that Bond is always so evergreen is because the movies keep happening. So it's always in the public consciousness. Whereas, you know, both Clancy and Rice kind of went off the movie screens for a while. That might have something to do with it. But the reason I brought this book to show and tell today is because it's a good example of how tough it can be to identify first editions sometimes, and how easily they're misidentified. And sometimes it's not enough to just see, you know, turn to the copyright page and see first printed 1984 or something. Sometimes you need to know about points of issue. So if we're talking for people who are new to book collecting, points of issue are a lot of fun. I think they can also be infuriating. Like, for years, what I thought was my first edition of You Only Live Twice on my shelf that I'd gotten, you know, as a kid, I discovered at some point that the second impression said first published in March 1964, and the first state that just said 1964. And I was like, oh shoot, I don't actually have a real first, you know, and that was infuriating. And I, you know, you finally tracked one down, but it's also fun. And for Hunt for Red October, it's especially strange because this was published by the Naval Institute Press, not known for fiction. Um, and it was a bestseller immediately. So it went into a zillion reprints, and they were all labeled first edition. You know, it was all and and then it would have the number line. The number line is something we know to look, collectors know to look for, where you'll look, a rule of thumb is the lowest number is the printing that it is, you know. So a complete number line would indicate a first printing. That's not true across the board, because there's some publishers who did things their own way, especially in the 70s. And there's all sorts of exceptions, but in general, that's what to look for. But with Hunt for Red October, there's tons. And so you'll find online, people are selling first editions all over the place that are really 17th printings or you know, or beyond, because it went into so many. The true first has some points of issue, one of which is that there are only 6 review quotes on the back cover, whereas later editions had 8 quotes. So that's something to look for first. There's no price, which is very unusual, because usually that indicates a book club edition when there's no price on the dust jacket. And again, subsequent editions of this book did have price written. The first has no price on the inside, and there's a barcode on the back, sort of etched in on the back. Now you'll find sometimes an indentation for book club editions on the lower left corner of the back of or lower right corner of the back of a book on the boards, but it's pretty unusual to have that, you know, barcode there. So it's these weird things that make it a first, and I like looking for that stuff. So that's the main reason I wanted to talk about this book, because it's an example of harder to find, you know, harder to identify what it is, and harder to sort through those online auctions, like, because you'll find so many things that look like great bargains and they're not actually firsts, and it might even give booksellers the impression that the book is worth less, because if you go on Abe Books or something, you might see a lot of lower prices and they're not the actual first edition. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I find that kind of stuff more on the infuriating side than the fun side. But I mean, like, it's interesting because Mccary, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, it's pretty easy to tell the UK first, right? I mean, they were pretty straight up about putting those impressions listed out there, so it's pretty simple to tell. Tim, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But
no, that's right. I mean, they're literally listed. I've not had any other problem with that.
But in the US first edition is really tricky, because they changed again. There was a change in the number of quotes on the back of the dust jacket, and on the inside you had to look for some stuff, and there was actually a transposed sentence on a certain page that you have to look for to double check. And it's gotten even trickier because there was some book club edition, they did a facsimile edition that's really sharp, really pretty, and it's got all that stuff almost all there, but it's not quite right. And so you got to really be careful, because it's that one's a trickier one to identify.
Yeah, that's a very tricky one, and one where you know, sometimes you'll see book clubs sold as it too. That happens a lot with this Clancy as well, because people, when they do a little research and they find, oh, the first didn't have a price on it, then they'll just think the book club is a first, which is actually a smaller size. So if you can actually compare them, it's easy to tell. But if you just see an online listing, the book club seems, yeah, it's not the first. But you know, sometimes first editions go beyond collectors and are of interest to readers, because they're actually different texts. You know, some things are changed in the text itself, like Ian Fleming's Diamonds Are Forever that Tim's looking for the book club of. The first edition had a different name for one of the characters, either Mr. Wint or Mr. Kidd, I can't remember who. He had named after one of his old school chums, who then didn't like being portrayed as a gay killer at the time, and so threatened to sue him. And we ended up with the classic names, Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, which are much better. I can't even recall what the previous one was. Do either of you remember?
I'm afraid not.
No.
But yeah, the first edition has different text because it has that different name. Or Le Carré's A Perfect Spy, the first UK edition, not the first US edition, but the UK one that preceded it, has a different end to the book, you know, which was it was changed in all subsequent editions. So yeah, it's interesting when you're actually getting some different text.
Jeff, shall I jump in with, given that Matthew's talking about people being named after people, I'm going to jump in with this one.
Go for it.
Octopussy, which you've all heard of. Very easy Bond book to collect. There was only ever one impression of it. It's it's not that expensive. It was bulk sold. It didn't even sell out at the time, so there's loads of good, clean copies sloshing around. It came out obviously after Fleming had died. There's a couple of little tricks with it. Most of them have a sticker where the price is. If you can get one like this that doesn't have the price sticker on it, that's more highly priced. And this is this was an online purchase, but this to me is an example of why it's worth building up relationships with people, even people you're dealing with on eBay. And I've been lucky enough to get on quite well with a few people who are selling books around the world. This is actually an auction copy. There's a chap in Britain who's well known called Henry Blofeld, who is quite a well-known cricket commentator, and this copy is actually signed by Henry Blofeld, which is fine. That kind of goes as far as it goes. But you'll recognize the name. Now, Henry Blofeld's father was a chap called Thomas Blofeld, and here inside this book is Thomas Blofeld's bookplate. Wow. So there are 14 copies in the world of Thomas Blofeld's collection of Ian Fleming novels. Now, this is obviously the cheapest, which is why I managed to buy it. But Thomas Blofeld was at Eton with Ian Fleming. I don't think there's a great deal of evidence that they didn't get on, but apparently what then happened was that Thomas Blofeld's son, John Blofeld, who is the brother of Henry Blofeld, the cricket commentator, beat up Ian Fleming's nephew at Eton. And the other chap who beat up Ian Fleming's nephew at Eton was a chap called Scaramanga. So when it came to sticking villains in his books, Ian Fleming was very keen on using Blofeld and Scaramanga. And so that makes it a very nice association copy, as Matthew says. Now, the 3 Blofeld bonds with the bookplate in which Blofeld actually appears are currently being sold by Thomas Pickard, who is a very high-end bookseller in Britain, frankly, with decent markup, I would say, on most of his stuff, for £6,500 for the 3. You can pick up other ones for, multiple hundreds of pounds. But I got this for an absolute song because the guy who bought it at auction when Henry Blofeld sold all his books a few years ago put up he's more than unwell. He's terminally ill, this guy. And so he decided to sell off his books. And I purchased quite cheaply his collection of the Evelyn Waugh Sword of Honor trilogy. And we got to talking. And then he suddenly said, I've got this. And it comes with the auction card, and I can see what it sold for online, about 4 years ago when Henry Blofeld sold all his books. And he gave it to me for a fraction of that, saying his son wasn't very interested in these books and he wanted it to go to someone who was interested. So as a result of, a few friendly messages via eBay, I've got what is probably the prize of my collection.
It's great.
That's an amazing piece. That's the Blofeld bookplate. Is there a coat of arms on it?
Yeah.
Even cooler from the Fleming standpoint of how important the Blofeld coat of arms is in
those of you on video, there it is. Those of you who can't see it, it's a sword with a lot of sort of fleur-de-lis and folderol around it, a lot of feathers, and some Latin, which I ought to have bothered to look at what it says, but I'm afraid I haven't.
Now, Tim, when you got this, did you ask for Henry Blofeld to include a photo of his earlobes so you could verify it?
Getting deep into the Bond trivia now.
Yeah.
No, that's great, Tim. That's awesome. Those are the things that are just so cool, I think, about collecting is finding those ones. All right, so I'm gonna go. And okay, so this isn't a book exactly. Well, sort of. I've got a book here. It's got a cover, but there's nothing written on it. And it's a book called Attacks of Taste. And this is something that was edited by a lady called Evelyn Byrne and Otto Penzler, who is well known as the Mysterious Bookstore owner and a huge spy aficionado himself. just recently sold off his spy collection to folks. And what this book was Evelyn Byrne was a teacher at a school in New York City. And what she did for the school newspaper is send out letters to all sorts of authors that had written books and ask them, what books did you read when you were a kid? And so she'd get those letters back, she'd print them in the newspaper. Well, eventually, it sounds like somehow Penzler heard about this and was like, this is great. We got to put this in a book. And so they collected around 60 or 70 of those to put in this book. And there's authors like Eric Ambler in here, and just a number of other kind of very famous authors. You know, Neil Simon appears, E.B. White, some others, Tennessee Williams, all these wide variety of authors talking about their stuff. So pretty cool book. It's signed, of course, you know, but anyway.
Signed by who?
Signed by the editors. So, but that's not the interesting part, really. The interesting part is there's an auction, eBay auction that I saw a while back with this letter from Jeffrey Household, who wrote Rogue Mail. And she had sent him a request about this. And so he wrote this nice 2-page letter back to her, detailing out all of the books and influences that he had when he was a kid. You know, H.G. Wells, Conan Doyle, all of that, and then signed it and sent it back to her. And then there's also another letter where he says that she was fine to print his letter in the book. And when she obviously asked about that, you know, can I reprint this thing? Interesting thing about all of that is that his letter didn't appear in the book. He was one of the ones that didn't make the cut of all of the letters that she got back. So I love that. Like, there's something about that personal connection in a letter like this that is really interesting to me. So especially for an author that, you know, kind of when you read him as a kid, you know, and Rogue Mail is so great. It's such a great book, right? I
That's
mean,
a
I don't
proper classic.
Yeah.
Amazing he didn't make the book. I mean, you know.
I know. Well, that's the thing that
Yeah.
was kind of wild. But yeah, so that makes it even a little bit more rare because it's not out there for folks to see. So
Very cool.
all right. Tim, do you got another one? Or wait, I forget where we're at now. Matthew?
I've got 3 books here with things shoved inside them that make them more interesting. But so I can do those if you like.
Matt, whoever wants to jump in.
This is the sort of, we're partly into, I don't think this is quite rabbit hole terrain, but it's a lot of things come with extras, and if you get the extras, you know. So here is this rather banal copy of the paperback movie tie-in of Thunderball, but here is the Player's Cigarette Domino promotional letter, and you have to look at it carefully because it's got a watermark and there's people faking them online and all the rest of it. Again, you know, as Matthew said, it's the dust jacket that's worth all the money with the first edition. You know, this, you know, chuck it over the shoulder if you like. This is gold dust.
I'm very jealous. That's been a grail of mine for years, finding that Domino letter. That's
and then there are books. The other thing to know about is sort of, you know, end papers. So the proper first of the Honourable Schoolboy has a map end papers. The export edition has white ones. You can find white first editions much cheaper. Len Dayton's really good for this. Horse Underwater, the second book, again, I think it's black end papers for a lot of the first impression print run, but those you can see, the more prized one is that there's a crossword in it. That's good. If you've got that as well, that's great. But what really adds some value is that they also sent out an actual printed crossword for you to fill in the clues in the book and post off and win a competition. Now, again, this doesn't enhance your reading experience, but if you've got one with the crossword end papers and the crossword competition, fill it in and send it off, that's worth having. And An Expensive Place to Die, they did something similar. The thing to have there is some of them were sold with this in-transit docket, which has 10 quite interesting sort of, you know, mock top secret documents that pertain to the plot of the book. And again, you know, a copy with that inside it is worth many multiples of just a standard first edition. I mean, none of these Daytons is criminally, expensive.
Yeah, I have one of those ones with the transit
apart
docket.
from the press file, but it's it's a nice thing to add a bit of interest and make it more of a collection than just I've got Len Dayton's books.
Yeah, it's those transit dockets are just amazing. That's one of my favorite little like added value things in a spy book, and designed by Raymond Hockey as well, right? Yep. And his company. And so in my US expensive place to die, I bought a very crappy version that came with the transit dockets and then put them into a nicer edition, which is still, you have to make sure that you're not mixing up the British and US because the copyright information is different on the transit dockets. That's the only thing different. But some collectors have a problem with that. We were talking about facsimile dust jackets. Some collectors don't like ever trading, a value added material or a dust jacket. I don't personally, as long as you make sure that it's the correct state. It's annoying down the road if people have put a second state dust jacket on a first edition or something. But as long as you're careful about that, I have no problem with Frankensteining, the perfect book. And that leads me into this next book, where, I think one of the most, right now, modern authors are very collectible because I have no proof of this, but just in terms of seeing the scarcity, I think they print a lot fewer books now than they used to, with ebooks and audiobooks being, a big part of the market. There's just fewer physical books printed, especially for a first-time author. Lauren Wilkinson's American Spy was a favorite of mine a couple of years ago and seems to have had an extremely small first print run here in America. But Mccary is one we all collect. And, I think he's one of the, hottest spy writers right now. And his early books, Tim and I were talking about this online, they're so hard to find in hardcover first editions. And
except for you.
No, it was very hard to find these. One of them was only printed in America, weirdly, Dead Lions. But Slow Horses, the first one, the sort of most prized one, it had a US and a British hardcover edition. The books are identical. It was printed in the EU according to the copyright information, and has the information for first published in the UK by Constable, an imprint of Constable and Robinson, 2010. First US edition published by Soho Constable, an imprint of Soho Press, 2010. So it's pretty unusual. I haven't seen too many where the same copyright information for US and UK is in the same book, but it does make it easier. The UK edition is extremely rare. Both are rare. Both, for a recent book, 2010, this is only a decade old. For a recent book, it's very hard to find any hardcover of this. And most of the ones that come up are ex-libraries that are often in pretty rough condition. But the good thing about ex-libraries is they preserve the dust jackets because they'll put Broad Arts on them from the start. And as long as it's not a library that tapes them or seals them in other ways to the book or to the dust jacket, you can get some good ones. So I found my UK copy was a ex-library. And from that, I was able to take the dust jacket, which is different only in that it says on the spine, it says Constable instead of Soho. And on the inside, the price, instead of dollars at the top, it says pounds at the bottom. And that almost amazes me that they bother to print separate dust jackets, because for other US, UK things, I've seen pounds at the bottom, dollars at the top, and they'll just cut off whichever one isn't applicable.
They seem to do that with some of the John Gardner Bond continuation ones, I think, didn't they? They was just,
well, I think for the export for Canada and Australia, but all the US ones had their own Putnam edition for that. But yeah, for Canada especially, a Cold Fall, or Cold as it was in the UK, is easier to find in the Canadian export. But yeah, so then I found a pristine American first edition, also not easy. And basically it was what Tim was talking about, if you take chances on these cheapo auctions where you don't know what you're going to get, and it's like kissing frogs, one turns into a prince. And eventually, so I didn't pay very much for any one of my hardcovers, but I ended up with quite a few hardcover firsts of Slow Horses to assemble my perfect UK one, which is actually a US, well, one that I got from with a US jacket, but the same book again, identical sheets printed, as far as I know. Maybe someone will chime in and say they know otherwise, and there's some obscure point of issue that differentiates them. But as far as I know, it's the same book, and I was able to marry it with the UK jacket for a nice UK first, and then also ended up with a nice US first out of that. And I like having both, and even the ones in iffier condition. Right now, that is a good investment. We talk about not all book collecting is a good investment, but I think Heron is definitely on his way up. There's a TV show coming. It's going to be even more so. So I'm kind of hanging on to those ones too. My hope was to get him to sign them at some point, all of them, but because he does do tours. But of course, with COVID, all book tours have been off. So we'll see if they ever resume. But yeah, it was not, bought a lot of them, but ended up with a nice first UK and first US in jackets, non-ex library.
So the question is, have you got any?
Sorry, what?
The question is, have you got any left? Because I've got a nice jacket, but a library copy inside. So.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can. I'm sure we can come up with a trade. I can help you out with that.
Yeah, I managed to find a couple of Slow Horses US editions. Somebody had like multiple copies, and they were selling them for like $15, and so I snapped those up right away. So, but not the UK, and that's the one that's going to be
really confirming your status as the lucky man in book collecting.
Yeah,
I walked into a shop on the Charing Cross Road about 6 months ago, and the guy went, "Well, I'll give you a bargain. You have it for 450 quid." I nearly fell over it.
wow.
I mean, online, these things are 700 to £1,000. I mean, it's ridiculous.
The other nice thing about this was that I was looking for these before, kind of in the early years, not right off the bat when it was published, but before he'd kind of taken off as much as he has. So it was.
You liked his early work, as they say. So
yeah.
Yeah, I found it was interesting because like down Cemetery Road, I found a signed copy of that relatively inexpensive, which that's actually his first novel. Right. So, but I don't think that'll have as much cachet as Slow Horses for sure. So
yeah, it doesn't seem to, but it's also been going up in price lately. All of his books seem to have, and again, I don't think there were a lot printed of Down Cemetery Road. I don't think there's as many avid collectors of those detective books as there are of Slow Horses.
Well, and Tim, online, you were talking about some of the weirdness with some of the printing, right? For his books as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, as Matthew said, I mean, he for a guy who is now regarded as sort of the great, white hope of spy writing, it's an astonishing, how the British publishing industry missed him is a mystery to me. I mean, as Matthew said, the first book, Slow Horses, has this sort of weird double publication with different dust jackets, and then he completely disappears in Britain. He didn't get picked up. There is no British copy of Dead Lions. You can only get an American first of that. Again, I've had to pick up a library copy because of the way things are at the moment. Then there, you can get a Soho US
of Dead Lions. You just have a library copy?
Yeah,
I can help you with that too.
I was hoping you must. And then from the third book, Real Tigers, you can get both, and both of those are still go for quite a lot of money these days. I'm not quite sure. Matthew might be able to help me which one predates the other, but they're both reasonably prized. And then from that point onwards, John Murray picked him up and made him a star in Britain. His American, there was a debate on the Spybrary website the other day about whether Heron's US publisher might want him to make changes and make them slightly less sort of British, but actually it was his American publisher that stuck with him, that made him be able to continue writing what is now probably about to become the most successful spy franchise, if this TV series is any good, that any of us have seen for a very long time, certainly since Spooks in this country, and I would imagine, and the first three are prized and difficult, and even when I started getting interested in Heron about sort of 18 months ago, you could still get hold of copies of those sort of first two. They were quite expensive, some of them, but they were still there. Now there's almost no copies available on any of the major websites. It's it's becoming really difficult. So you know what I've done, as I said earlier, is take potluck, as I did with Adam Hall, on some of these, you know, library sellers. And again, I haven't, you know, even the library ones are pretty pricey here. So it's yeah, it's a difficult market. But then of course Mick likes the sign, and you know the later ones are 10 a penny sign. So it's you know, it's an interesting, you know, swings and roundabouts. And then, you know, as I say, I mean, I collect first, but you know, I've got one that Mick signed to me when I bumped into him in a bookstore, and that's my more prized possession, even though it's a third impression of London Rules. We were both at an Authors of the Year bash at Blackwell's bookshop, and he was there, and we had a couple of other spy people there, and I was only there having written a book about politics, and I didn't really want to intrude. And then I basically turned in. I went scrolling around the bookshop trying to find a copy of one of Mick's books, and was saddened to discover only a third available on the shelf, but immediately bought the only copy of it so I could march up like a fanboy. And fortunately, Mick, being, you know, the generous and lovely chap that he is, we had a great chat, and yeah, that was a memorable night. So I won't ever get rid of that copy, even though it's not a first.
That's great.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing of collect. You know, some people are all about getting the most pristine version that you can, and that's a part of it. But to me, the story of how I got it is important. So like, yeah, I can totally see why you prize that third that's signed at an event where you were both featured writers. Like that in particular makes it just such a nice piece. And it's the same with those early Flemings I got, or I mean, not with the ones that I got early in my collecting. They're not all in the best shape, you know, like some of them were, because I'm finding them at book sales and stuff like that, but I still prize them. You know, I don't have an ambition to upgrade my, you know, some of those things, because that copy to me is the one that I, you know, searched and searched for and found, and I remember where I found each one of them, you know, and I like, that has a personal value to me. So I think it's, you do your own thing collecting, you know, like some people, as I say, all about the condition, some people all about specific editions. And both those do matter to me, but not more than anything to me is the story of how I found it.
Yeah, and the other guy I've been lucky enough to get to know through my job as a political journalist is Robert Harris, who's not quite a spy writer, but, you know, very successful thriller writer. And, you know, I've got all of his signs. Some of them I bought online, but the ones that I value are the ones he has signed to me. And the most recent one, I took my then, you know, about 6-month-old daughter along to the book launch, and he signed it to me, my wife, and my daughter. And that's my favorite one of all of my Robert Harrises.
That's great.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I know. I that's one of the things that I worry a little bit, that COVID is killing right now, is book tours by any authors anymore. You know, I mean, I don't know that that's going to continue now. Are we just going to see folks on Zoom and that's it? You know, so that's my kind of worry as we go into 2021.
Yeah, and that tipped in pages will become the only way to get signed books, essentially.
Yeah. So fingers crossed us book collectors can find a way around that, because I do love going to meet authors. I mean, we still get a decent amount of them coming through Chicago, so that's always something. Like Joseph Cannon, I've seen a couple of times. He was in Chicago a few years back, and then I was doing a road trip through DC and went to Politics and Prose when he was speaking there, and got to get his latest book signed there, The Defectors, which was wonderful to hear him speak about that book too, because there's some great stories behind that one. So
nice.
That's part of being a collector, I think, is being able to meet some of the authors that you're collecting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I got one more, and then maybe, I'm not sure where we're at time wise. I've got to look at the clock here, but
It's a long episode.
Yes. All right. So maybe we'll wrap it up after, if there's anything else that anybody really wants to show. But this one I have Charles Mccary, who I love. His works they're just wonderful. This is Second Sight. And the reason I found this one fun, and again, this was another one of those, bought it for, you know, very, very small amount, but you never know what you're going to get. But it was signed, and it was signed to Marjorie, I believe is how you'd say it. And it says, who is responsible for much that is good in this book and for much that could not be fitted in, and to Steve, who generously gave her the time off to do the job. Affectionately, Chaz Mccary. And looking in the back, if you look at the acknowledgments, you see that she was one of the people that helped him research the book. and a lot of the stuff that was in here. So I love that stuff. That just is so cool.
That's
So
very cool.
that's one of the ones that I really liked.
Well, I just want to, since we talked about them, just show real quick some of the fancy editions. Like, here's a Franklin Library leather-bound Smiley's People, which is there's been a couple of, Easton did a Smiley's People later on. They're both nice, but this one I just really like the spine in particular. It's a nice, there's a very tactile aspect to collecting for me, and I like the way that this book feels. I like a lot of the leather ones have good weight to them too, and I like that. And then another one that I didn't talk about is the Folio Society, who does these amazing slipcase. They're not leather bound, but I'm such a sucker for a slipcase. If you put a book in a slipcase, I'm 50% more likely to buy it, no matter what it is. And the design on this Spy Who Came In From the Cold that they did is just one of my favorite book designs. They do absolutely beautiful books, and this one in particular, it's two-tone to reflect the divided Berlin. It's got this 1960s typeface, and the textures of the two tones are very different. There's a grainy cardboard sort of feeling to one side, and there's a very cloth, almost like a suit cloth kind of texture to the other. And yeah, it's also very nicely illustrated. They just do really nice editions, and they're affordable. When they come out, you can get folio editions. Sometimes it's hard, they do go out of print, and then they can go up. Not all of them. Some of them you'll get cheaper after the fact, but generally, if you want to collect those, I recommend buying them as they come out, because they also go into subsequent printings, and you might end up with a second printing of the folio edition. But
I love that version of the Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I try and avoid limited editions like the plague, just because I don't want to start collecting something else. But I love those. Those are that one is in particular is really beautiful.
And they're doing a very nice run of bonds at the moment. I think they've done 10 or 11 so far. And I find the spine's a bit boring, but the cover artwork is spectacularly good, and they're beautifully illustrated inside.
Oh yeah, and I saw you saying that too. I do recommend getting them, because the spines, again, like with that, it's much more about the texture to me than the typeface, and they're just these really beautiful. I think the cloth was chosen to mimic Bond's suits in the early movies, kind of. They're very tactily satisfying, is all I can say. Like those spines, I think you'll value them more in person, like having the book in hand, than you might seeing them online.
Well, I know I have loved this conversation. It's nice to talk to folks that are like-minded. I'll play this back to my wife to say there are others of us out here. We're not crazy. This is okay. It's, we don't have to go to therapy over it. So I don't know, at a certain point it can become a mania. But you just got to try and walk the tightrope, right?
Yeah. I mean, I suspect my wife is standing outside the room now going, "What are you going on about in there?"
Stop those boxes from being delivered. Every time another book-sized box shows up, I get that look. So, well, sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
I can't say it's not a mania, but it's a pleasurable mania.
There are a lot worse things to get into, I think it's fair to say.
That is true. Well, great. Matthew, if folks want to find what else you're up to, what's the best way to do that?
My spy blog, 00section.blogspot.com, has all sorts of, there's even some posts about collecting that I call Judging a Book by Its Cover, where I'll review books purely on their physical attributes, which everything we've been cautioned against as long as we've read books. But like I say, I really like that kind of physical sensation of a book. But also I have a lot of actual book reviews and stuff like that.
Great. Tim, same for you. If folks want to keep up with your projects, what's the best way to do that?
Well, my journalism's at times.co.uk. I write every weekend in the Sunday Times, contribute to various podcasts as well there. And my personal musings on Twitter at Shippers Unbound.
Nice. That's great. Well, and you can find my writing on specifically collecting. We'll put some stuff in the show notes that I've written for my site, spywrite.com. And there's also an episode of Spybrary that we talked about some collecting do's and don'ts. So we'll also link to that down there. That's it for this episode of Spybrary. Check out the show page for more information about the things we talked about today. Join a Facebook group to interact with your fellow spy fans. That's how Matthew and Tim and I get to talk to each other. It's really wonderful experience. Or you can join the Patreon to help support the show and keep more episodes coming. Thanks for listening.